I also want to share with you how Lincoln's position also cascaded down to others. Maybe a story about Grant to Lee in Virginia in 1864 that highlights this issue as well. Grant and Lee were in negotiations about prisoner of war exchanges, but Grant thought something was up. He didn't quite trust Lee. So he sends him a letter as they're doing his negotiations, asking him, are you going to respect the African-American soldiers you captured as part of this trade? Lee sends back the letter. It's absolutely not. This deeply offended Grant will even suggest that we treat those African-American soldiers as equals. Grant's response, he ended the prisoner of war exchange discussions. He was not going to proceed unless Lee treated all the U.S. Army soldiers as equals. Again, reflecting the sentiment that was present. And after 1865, this is where racial terror takes on for the American People, a likeness they had never seen before. And especially when chide American historians on how little this topic has been discussed. The first incident I'm going to mention is the Memphis Massacre of 1866. I heard a talk by Stephen Ash. He's the first one to write a book on this. And he wrote it just a few years before the 150th anniversary. And he admitted when people urged him to study this topic, the Memphis Massacre is another immense supports. The 14th Amendment, you can directly tie to this massacre. And Ash said he couldn't believe that no one had written on this, and he assumed it's because there wasn't that many primary sources available. When he got into the topic, he started looking at the events. He found there was not just one federal investigation, not two, but three of the Memphis Massacre. So he went from a situation of having almost no material, he thought, to way more into what he needed for a book. And again, constantly asking to the writing of this book, why am I the first one to write on this effects? Now, what occurred at the beginning of the Memphis Massacre is especially important for us as Lincoln stories. You have African-American soldiers at the fort there in Memphis. And on April 30th, they were discharged. And on May 1st, members of the white population attacked them. Right before the first attack occurred, and Memphis police officers moving forward to attack these veterans, one of the officers yelled out a phrase which is very, very telling. He tells these five veterans, your Abe Lincoln is dead. Again, this is about a year after the assassination. And then the violence erupts. Over 3 days, over 40 African Americans are murdered, fire raped. Every black church is burned down. And he also targeted every black school. They knew the value of education. Eventually, federal troops that were left at the fort on the fourth day start going around Memphis, and the massacre ends. Grant is furious that this occurred, and once the people are arrested, he seeks advice from Washington. President Andrew Johnson turns to his attorney general. His attorney general tells him, there's nothing we could do, which is exactly what Johnson wanted to hear. There's then a massacre at New Orleans. They clearly see the White House as a back, and just a few months later, and all the attacks and reconstruction retain. I fully believe the way you described the construction has been erroneous for decades. You might have often heard Reconstruction failed. I prefer Eric Foll's approach when he said Reconstruction was defeated. All these strives they did were countered by this white supremacy, which again dates back to the 1600s, which echoes exactly the sentiment that Stephen Douglas said. And then as we move to the 1800s, we arrived eventually at the beginning of the 20th century. And the veterans from the Civil War, many of them have passed away, the early new generation. And this generation, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, look back at the Civil War veterans in the same way that Lincoln to look back at the American Revolutionary War was. Shortly after he was assassinated, John Hay, who'd been one of Lincoln's secretaries, approached the new president, Theodore Roosevelt, tendering his resignation as Secretary of State. Roosevelt would hear nothing of it. He had admired Lincoln as the greatest American, and having John Hay in his cabinet was perfect as a bait. And so what Roosevelt has is for after he's elected to that inauguration, John Hay, knowing Roosevelt's admiration of Lincoln, gives him a ring that contains a lock of Lincoln's hair. You'll find consistency throughout his presidency. Roosevelt was consistently praising Lincoln. Taft, too, is a huge Lincoln supporter, and so also is Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson, born in Virginia, he identifies himself as a Southerner, and he sees Lincoln as the way to bridge the gap between the two sides of the country. But he has a much, much different view of African Americans than Lincoln did. He segregates the federal government and continues those policies throughout his presidency. And in 1940, starting construction of the Lincoln Memorial. I found it fascinating. If you look at American history, between 1914, when this starts, and it concludes in 1922, what else is going on in the country? Because you have to understand the construction of this in the context of everything that's going on. In 1950, a year after they started the Lincoln Memorial, D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation, is released. It makes more money than all other films in American history before. 3,000 people in Los Angeles bought tickets to watch this film. 3,000. If you never watched this film, purely for educational purposes, I urge you to do so. It's one of the most horrific films you will ever see. And I had experience watching it with a mixed audience. And I could tell you, it is incredibly uncomfortable watching how Griffith portrayed African Americans in that film. But remember, this was the most popular film in America in 1950. To make it even more ironic, D.W. Griffith claimed he was a huge Lincoln supporter. And he made all the scenes showing Lincoln as accurate, as perfect as he possibly could. Thomas Dixon wrote the novel that this film was based on. The novel was called The Klansman. It's showing how Ku Klux Klan was rescuing rights from the African Americans. And Woodrow Wilson showed that film in the White House in 1950. It was the first film shown in the White House. He was a great friend of Dixon, who wrote the novel, who wrote the screenplay, and is giving extraordinary presidential blessing the film and the philosophy that it exposed. In 1916, they finished the base of the Lincoln Memorial. And then it brings us to 1970. I'm going to discuss 3 lynchings. I already discussed the Memphis Massacre. 1917, I want to talk about the El Persons. I want you to note, these 3 that I'm mentioning are not unknown. They were very well known at the time. All Americans should know these 3 incidents. An El Persons is occurred in Memphis, Tennessee. A young girl by the name of Antoinette Rappel. She was 15 years old. She bites between her home and school every day. One day she didn't come home, and there was massive search to try to find her. They found her bicycle upright near this bridge, which indicates whatever happened, she or her attacker. They found tracks from a car, and also a very expensive white coat. As they went into the woods, they found her body, and she'd been decapitated. Now, with 3 pieces of evidence I just offered you, speaking with criminologists about this, they were like, clearly you're going after a white person, very few blacks on cars, and someone of some wealthy status. But at the time, none of the police records show any indication that they'd even thought about that. Instead, a suit who was a black man. And so they scurried around looking for any of the black men that lived near this site. Alferson's been married a year before. He had a 2-3-month-old child. He was a woodcutter. It was an easy target. Get an axe. So they arrested him. Of course, he didn't confess to the crime. They electrocuted, beat him, until eventually they got something reflecting a confession. And all those techniques were considered acceptable at that time. They took him out of town on train because they were afraid what would happen. But as he came back into town on train, they announced what the train was. It was stopped to mark out the train full of off. This is the wonderful thing that now happens. They advertise in the newspaper that there's been a lynching, and they identify the location. Kids will excuse school. A mob of maybe 3,000 Americans, who has the highest profile, gathered as a festival there to watch this event. They doused his body with gasoline, and they let him on fire. Afterwards, and this is very common in lynchings, they cut up the body as souvenirs. Took off its head, down to Beale Street, placed the African-American businesses, and threw it into the street. It was advertised in newspapers nationally. The Wilson administration said nothing. They said absolutely nothing about it, even though they knew about it. Afterwards, J. Logan Johnson was a field secretary for the NAACP. He goes down to investigate this lynch. He found absolutely no evidence the person was responsible. But as he's standing at the bridge, where all persons have been burned, comes up this remarkable phrase. It says, "I am afraid for the black man's body and the white man's soul." But the construction of Lincoln Memorial continued. In 1918, they now finished all the colonnades. The 36 colonnades representing the 36 states in the Union were completed a year after Alperson's lynching. And then that brings us to 1919. That year is probably the worst for racial terror in American history. The term Red Summer is often used. African Americans was lynched in Chicago, in Omaha, and throughout the South. But the one I'm going to especially focus on is one that occurred in Arkansas, is of the direct involvement of Wilson's administration. So a group of African Americans, these are sharecroppers, are working in the cotton fields. They need, considering the possibility of developing a union, whatnot. This is in Northeast Arkansas. And a group of whites was still there to watch what's going on. Somehow shots were fired, and the white male was killed. I'm trying to come up with an image of what it was like before in Phillips County, Arkansas. The only image I can think of it, imagine this giant pile of dry wood. Just city. Somebody flicks a match up. And he looks like a flying race. The governor of Arkansas that fall, the rumor says the African Americans were rising up in force, in arms, only rebelled. And the Arkansas governor was more than willing to believe this. Then he contacts Washington. Contacts the Wilson administration, asking for federal troops. Wilson approves it. Over 500 U.S. Army soldiers then take the train into Phillips County to put down this rebellion. Many of them had served in France with the Army. They're going to use the same weapons and the same techniques that they won there against the Germans, against the American population of Phillips County. And there were the White Locks of Mississippi that came over. Dozens of African Americans were killed, but again, I want to focus on what the U.S. Army troops did. In two major incidents. In one instance, they spread out, they move across the field where many African Americans were hiding. Every time they saw one, was shot, killed. In the second incident, they rounding them into cane fields, and then men, women, children, they fire. Eyewitnesses talk about the rit-tat-tat with a machine gun fire they heard. as the U.S. Army troops carried out this mission. Now think about where the U.S. Army was in the Lincoln, what it did during the Reconstruction, and now where it is now in 1919. The estimates would never probably going to know how many were killed in the Lane Massacre. Some say at least 100, some has 200-300. It could be the worst racial massacre in our history. But the important aspects to consider as the U.S. Army's participate in this. I wear the blessing of the American president. Just 2 months after the Lane Massacre, the lower half of Lincoln's statue, the 19 by 19-foot statue, is complete. In January 1920, the upper part was complete. Basically, Lincoln Memorial, as we see it today, was finished. The next 2 years, it finished a landscape of the bewildered sidewalks to arrives dedication ceremony in 1922. Taft had been the leader of his commission after his presidency. He was now Chief Justice. An array of white men, they said it should at least reach out to at least one African American. And this is tokenism right here on Lincoln's Praise Memorial. A person I selected was Dr. Robert Boating, second president of the Tuskegee Institute. I asked him to deliver remarks. But Taft didn't trust him. So they asked Boating to send his remarks so he could look at it. And Taft was appalled by all the comments Boating put in there about Lincoln's unfinished work. Chief Justice and Supreme Court ordered Boating to remove all those references in his speech. Specifically told him this speech is going to be that unity, not the reason. American court. When he stood up to give his remarks to Lincoln Memorial, he faced a segregated audience. A white on one side, a black on another, reflecting all the culture of the time. And Wilson was no longer president, and he was devastated he could not be there. He was in B.C., and he had to listen to the ceremony on radio. I guarantee you, he was healthy enough, he would obey. I also want to highlight one other individual was there. Robert Todd Lincoln was in fact there. As many of you know, he was head of Pullman Car Company for years. And understanding how the Pullman Car Company worked, how it made its profits, that's another incredible insight to American society at that time. All the quarters were black, one passenger for what? Now, sometimes when you talk about the Pullman Car Company, they highlight the incredible detail they do in their passenger cars. If you look at the advertisements, it's not what they sell. If you look at the advertisements, it's always a smiling court. That's what they were advertising. The African American history had this wonderful phrase, which I'll share with you, to define George Pullman's mind. He said it was plantation, a start. Black men, Surrey, white customers. Several times, black individuals tried to get on Pullman Friday, refused. They didn't even have name tags. They were all called George. At the George Pullman. And you were allowed to beat up, kick up. Again, reflecting that time period. And the Pullman Car Company was incredibly successful in North and South, profiting folks. After the dedication of Lincoln Memorial, 3 years later, if you had any hope this would somehow change the way Americans think about things, one of the most remarkable marches, horrific perhaps, occurs in Washington, D.C. 3 years after the dedication of Lincoln Memorials, over 30,000 Americans marched down Pennsylvania Avenue and the road to the Ku Klux Klan. All the philosophy that organization represents. Now, what's interesting in the 1930s, the Battle of the Lincoln's memory at the Lincoln Memorial shifts in the book here. Any of you know Marion Anderson, an African-American woman, was denied the right to sing in the Daughters in the American Revolution. The Secretary of Interior, Hale Eckes, under the Roosevelt administration, Eleanor Roosevelt pushed to have her at the Lincoln Memorial. FDR was tasked with approval, and she sang there. And her remarks were not eight. She spoke freely, she sang freely there as the moment had been denied in 1922. Now, coronation occurs within 1863, King Marshall Washington. I remember one day when I was at the Lincoln Memorial, I saw a young Darren so, and he kept pointing down one of the steps. And of course, he and his son never knew if they'd get to the Lincoln Memorial again. But he did not want his son to forget this mark. And I couldn't initially figure out what was he pointing at. And then it occurred to me. His dad was pointing at the step where King had given a speech. It was unmarked. But his dad has done a research. He knew exactly where it was and what shared. So, and I would argue with you today that 2003, the Lincoln Memorial was not completed until 2003. Because in that years, they finally put plaques to identify the spot where King spoke. And King spoke about the unfinished work, as Milton wanted to do in 1922. So I suggest to you, the Lincoln Memorial was finished, and they had a plaque that talked about the unfinished work that lays before us. That